there have been great strides done internationally against the alleviation of poverty, and we must not go back in that enterprise. So then when we protect the environment, I feel we also need to do it in a way protecting economic growth as well, because it brings such huge social and economic benefits.
Hello and welcome to the Plant Paradigm Podcast, where we have inspiring conversations with amazing individuals from all around the world and look for ways to create a clean, green and sustainable future for us, the planet and all beings. I'm your host, Tom Simak, an athlete and fellow plant eater who is your host to help facilitate these impactful conversations. Who you heard at the beginning was Professor Pericles Pilidis. Pericles completed his doctorate in Gas Turbine Engineering at Glasgow University, and for many years he was the director of Thermal Power Master's course and the head of the Gas Turbine Engineering Group at Cranfield University. Since 1994, he's been working on hydrogen projects for gas turbines in air, land, and sea, and has published many works and studies on this subject, which is exactly why I wanted to have him on the show. In the effort to tackle climate change, we need every advantage and every little slight edge, especially when it comes to technological solutions. Currently, Pilidis is taking a large part in gas turbine research and postgraduate education, and he's the course director of the Masters of Science in Thermal Power and contributes to hydrogen projects. His career has seen him work with Rolls Royce, Airbus, EasyJet and Boeing, among many others. In this conversation, we'll be diving into his work and what the power of hydrogen can do for the environment, the upsides, alongside the potential downsides, challenges, and fallbacks. There is a part of this conversation where he does reference slides. Now, I have access to these slides, so for that particular part of the podcast, I do recommend you jump on YouTube and just watch that. Time is the exact same timestamp. It does help bring the point home. Of course, it's not necessary. We try to explain it in the best possible way for those of you listening to the audio. But for someone who is very interested in the topic of hydrogen and the role that technology can play in the solution to this climate emergency, I recommend just watching that YouTube video for that particular time, whether it's 5 or 10 minutes it goes for. But it is a complicated topic, so I do recommend, if this is your passion and you love hydrogen or are very interested, get ready to take some notes, because this is a bit of a wild journey and a very intellectually stimulating journey as well. With that being said, I hope you learn a thing or two and enjoy this conversation between Professor Pericles Pilidis and I will see you on the other side. Professor Pericles Pilidis, welcome to the Plant Paradigm Podcast. How are you going?
Very well. It's very good to be able to talk to you. Let me start by saying that, I have been working for, including studies, nearly 40 years in aerospace. I have never seen it as exciting as it is today.
Wow. What an incredible way to set the stage. You know how to get people excited.
Yeah.
Look, let's really set the stage here. I mean, you have been working in this field for a while, and can you just explain to us what exactly you specialize in and why it makes you excited?
My profession, I work in gas turbine engines. So I'm a gas turbine engineer, and this is mechanical engineering. Gas turbines are very widely used in air, land, and sea applications. In air, of course, jet engines are gas turbines. On land, you use gas turbines to produce electricity, to pump gas through pipelines. On land, sometimes for powering vehicles, and at sea for ship propulsion.
Beautiful. And look, there is one other thing that you're really excited about, which is the hydrogen power. And it's something that we're going to be talking a little bit about on this show today. On this show, we talk about sustainability a lot, and it is a
Yes.
key topic. It's become a sexy word in media, and it's something that we have noticed, through the COP26 and COP27 this year, it's incredibly important to start to think about this on a very practical matter. How can we introduce different technologies to help take us to a greener society? And when people Google your name, they're going to come across a lot of information about and adjacent to hydrogen power. So I
Yes.
thought you'd be the perfect person to explain to us all what exactly hydrogen power is.
Before we start talking about hydrogen power, let me go back a step and tell you a little bit about sustainability. Uh, in my eyes, and hopefully in the eyes of many people, sustainability is not only protecting the environment, sustainability is also protecting economic growth.
Mhm.
If you look at it globally, what you find is that for many people, the economic growth, and we are seeing it vividly today, is a much more important issue than the environment. There have been great strides done internationally against the alleviation of poverty, and we must not go back in that enterprise. So then, when we protect the environment, I feel we also need to do it in a way protecting economic growth as well, because it brings
Mhm.
such huge social and economic benefits. And again, I feel, and many people around me feel, that technology is the solution. And the key technology in this context is hydrogen for this sustainability in the dual sense of environment and economy.
Yeah, I totally agree. And we live at the end of the day in a capitalistic society, and for these technologies to be adapted at a widespread level, they have to be economical. Otherwise, no one's going to pick them up, because we have to make them economical for businesses to do their part, and they need to be profitable for governments not to just lose money out of their pockets, because it is a limited resource,
Mhm.
or in a way it's
Exactly.
unlimited, but it's also limited at the same time. So
Yes.
I agree that it has to be economical for this to work, and
Yes.
it happens to have sustainable and environmental benefits, which is a nice way to see it.
We're speaking from the same platform, I'm glad to see.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So when we're talking about hydrogen power in how it can, I mean, when I think of it, and I think when a lot of people think of it, it's that stream of water or river of water, and you got that little, I guess, turbine or propeller
Hmm.
turning the water, and then that's creating some sort of electricity. And for all I know, and this might be year 10 chemistry, it's just a combination of hydrogen and oxygen, and that generates electricity. Now, when you think at that simple level, it baffles me that this concept can have the potential to power things like airplanes and even cities. How is this
Yes, yes.
possible?
Um, let's go to the airplane first, or a ship, for this matter, a car as well. Um, these vehicles rely on the heat of combustion of a fossil fuel normally. This fossil fuel could be natural gas, this fossil fuel could be coal, this fossil fuel could be jet fuel in aviation, or diesel fuel in, again, land and sea. This generates heats, and this drives what we call thermal engines. This is a piston engine or a gas turbine or a steam turbine, and then this produce power. Some of these engines are used to produce electricity in coal plant or in a, a liquid fuel plant. Or instead of producing electricity, they can produce the power that moves a vehicle. And the issue with these fossil fuel is they have brought us a lot of benefits, but we're starting to see a lot of side effects in terms of uh, carbon that is being emitted globally. Hydrogen also burns, but when hydrogen burns, it produces water. And the idea then is to use hydrogen to replace the fossil fuels. So you can use the hydrogen in an aircraft engine, of course, in a modified aircraft engine, to move you around the world, to take you from the UK to Australia, or to travel in different places. It can be used in cars. It can also be used to produce electricity. Hydrogen, however, does not occur naturally. Hydrogen is chemically very reactive, and a good solution is to separate it either from fossil fuels, which creates carbon pollution, or to separate it using electrolysis, using electricity to separate carbon from using water as a resource.
And so when we're talking about using water as a resource, and this is the first thing that came to my mind, we've got these, it's a chemical reaction, the hydrogen oxygen, like I mentioned before. Is there a way that we can, or that can become an unsustainable practice, like where we originally get these compounds of hydrogen and oxygen from? Does that come from a river source? Does that come from, where does the original compound come from? Much like fossil fuels come from the earth, does this also come from the earth?
Yes, the source of hydrogen would be water. And we are talking about prodigious quantities of water. If we're thinking of replacing globally the fuel, just to give you an example, the United Kingdom would need something like 15,000 tons of hydrogen every day. And to produce these 15,000 tons of hydrogen, you need, just as an initial resource, 150,000 tons of water a day. Of course, in Britain it would be okay. In a handful of other countries to do this, it would be okay. In Australia, it wouldn't. In Australia, you know better than I do, fresh water is a precious resource, and then seawater would need to be used, which makes it a little bit more expensive. But then using seawater as the resource to produce hydrogen, then we have a sustainable solution. And this water then becomes part of the water cycle because the hydrogen is extracted from the water, the hydrogen is then consumed as a fuel, forms water again, and it re-enters the water cycle.
Oh, that's fascinating. So, because what I was thinking is, are we going to drink our oceans dry for a moment? But essentially, we extract this water, it goes into the engine to create the electricity, and then the compound that exits from the end, so the byproduct of hydrogen electricity, is also hydrogen. So, essentially, in an
Is
aircraft, what
water,
I'm
is water.
visualizing.
Yes,
So,
is
is there
water.
water like coming down from the airplane, or does that come as like condensation to create clouds, or how does that work exactly?
You mentioned condensation. By flying carefully, and by carefully I mean at slightly lower altitudes, for some flights, you avoid the clouds because clouds on their own could have a global warming effect. So, we'd also need to fly at a slightly lower altitude. So we would like to avoid the clouds. And this water would appear as water vapor in the atmosphere, as humidity, and eventually it would end up in precipitation. One thing we're looking at Cranfield is how to burn the hydrogen, um, greatly reducing nitrogen oxides. Nitrogen oxides are one of the causes of acid rain, and we're looking to avoid that as well. So then all you have is clean rain coming back down eventually.
So is one of the dangerous, I guess someone could argue against hydrogen power by mentioning that one of the byproducts is nitrogen oxide. So is that true? Is that one of the byproducts? Is that why you mentioned it?
I mentioned it because hydrogen could produce nitrogen oxides if you do not design the combustor of the engine carefully. So if you learn, and this is what you are learning at Cranfield, how to design the combustor to burn hydrogen but with very low nitrogen oxides, then you essentially remove that problem.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You see,
Fascinating. So when we're Yeah, please go for it.
Yes, hydrogen, if you avoid NOx, it produces nothing else but water. There's no carbon dioxide. There are no what we call unburned fuel coming out. There are no aromatics. You may have noted when you approach an airport, there is a typical airport smell, isn't there? Which is a fuel type
Yes.
smell of unburned hydrocarbons. That, of course, would disappear with hydrogen.
Fascinating. That would be kind of nice, actually.
Yes,
So, is there, or what problems have you come across? I mean, there's lots of, as you mentioned at the beginning, there are consequences that we are now realizing are very real with fossil fuels.
yes.
There's you can't really argue that. Now, hydrogen, if it were to become a key player amongst the potentials of solar and wind and even biofuels and these kinds of technologies, do you think there are a lot of problems that you have to tackle first? Like, what are some of the things we have to think of before we really start to introduce this heavily into the way we live?
The issue is cost. That is the single big factor that needs to be accepted. And the cost is
Mhm.
temporary. The high cost of producing hydrogen is a transition cost. There are many organizations that know more than me that say in the long term, hydrogen will be cheaper than hydrocarbon fuels.
Mhm.
The issue about cost then is a transition that will cost trillions of Australian dollars or British pounds. And this cost is the cost associated with handling the hydrogen and producing the hydrogen. Again, just to give you an example, the 15,000 tons of hydrogen that the UK would need, this is daily, would require an investment in electricity to produce the same amount of electricity the whole country uses today. So there is
Mm.
this big installation cost. You mentioned renewables. We see as renewables as being one of the sources of electricity that is going to be needed to produce hydrogen. So then you have renewable electricity producing hydrogen from water, separating water and oxygen, the oxygen and hydrogen from the water, the hydrogen being
Mhm.
used as a fuel. And that is the hydrogen stroke water chain we're looking at. Big investment in electricity.
Yeah, definitely. There is a lot of investments that have to be made.
Yes,
Um, do you know if what is the country that is? So I know in Australia, Tasmania, I think powers a very large chunk of their state with hydroelectricity. And when you drive around Tasmania, you just see these massive hydro
yes, yes.
plants. At what level or when are we getting ready to see how this can be played out at a country and national level? Like, is it possible right now for the UK, for example, to have the technology to power themselves partially with hydro technology?
The UK is looking at big investments in electricity in primarily wind energy and nuclear. Uh,
Mhm,
just to go back to these 15,000 tons of hydrogen a day, if the UK were to produce the electricity from solar needed to produce
mhm,
this hydrogen, we would need to cover half of Wales in solar cells. The interesting
mhm,
thing, however, is half of Wales is nearly not visible in the middle of Australia, where you have a lot of sunshine.
mhm.
And
Yeah.
the question I ask myself is, there are, many parts of Australia that are essentially deserted. Those
Mhm,
could be covered with photovoltaic panels in a small part to produce the electricity that is needed for Australia to produce hydrogen from seawater.
mhm,
But also the question I ask myself, is there any value to that shade that those solar cells are going to put in place? So by removing some of the solar energy from the surface of the Earth, is there a possibility for improvements in that shade that these photovoltaic cells are going to create?
And what do you think? Is there something you can put underneath the solar
For
that is
example,
producing
yes.
electricity?
Uh, uh,
Fascinating.
well, I see that your your website has a lot to do with tourism and travel. And then,
Yeah.
are you in a better position to answer that question as opposed to me, who am an engineer?
Well, I'm not too sure. I mean, I used to definitely previously this podcast was about traveling
Yes,
sustainably. What I find really fascinating to question that is there's lots of possibilities in the way that we can use solar. I'm sure hydro has the same, but one example
yes,
that comes to my mind is California, as we're all aware, is a deserted landscape for a large part. In some parts of it, they're
yes,
extremely hot. And the river that they actually got a lot of their fresh water from, the problem that they had during the summertime is that the water was evaporating. So, a solution that the engineers in California came up with is actually putting solar panels on top of the river. So it
yes.
shades it from the sun, but the water keeps the batteries cool so that the batteries become more efficient. So that's the only kind of, I guess, analogy or story I have that's kind of adjacent to what you were mentioning about the shade.
Oh,
Um,
that's fascinating, because then you can also produce the electricity from one side and stop the
mhm,
evaporation from the other. That's fascinating. I didn't know that.
mm. Yeah, I was very, very pleased to hear that
Yes,
people have thought of that because it seems so logical when you hear
yes,
it.
yes,
But
yes.
for 20, 30 years for someone to think, "Hey, this is a good idea," that's the funny part.
Good ideas
Um,
are very often very simple, and once people thought of them, they say, "But how simple it was! Why didn't we think about it before?"
mm, have you come across examples like that in the field of I mean, do you work a lot with making gas turbines more efficient?
Yes, that is actually occupying a lot of our times. How
Mm,
to improve the different components that make up the engine to reduce the energy cost in, say, moving people
right,
around. And if you look, really, the gas turbine is the heart of the jet engines. From when jet engines came about to today, we're probably using per person less than a third of the fuel that we used to use when jet engines or
wow.
jet transport first started. So, I mean, huge improvements being made, both in efficiency, but also in terms of what we call the environment friendliness. Lower
Mm.
noise, lower nitrogen oxides, desulfurized fuels, and so on. And
I mean,
we're in a stepping stone now to the next step, to remove carbon dioxide.
yeah, well, I was gonna go into the next question, which, you mentioned that we're using a third of the amount of fuel and overall energy it took to
Yes.
transfer person A to B using jet planes. And now, obviously, there's a bell curve where the efficiency hits its absolute maximum peak, which
Hmm.
is what happens with a lot of technology and just life in general. It's a very
Yes,
safe
yes.
rule of thumb. How much energy, or are you worried that we're devoting a lot of manpower to making these gas fuels very efficient when instead we should be using those resources on renewable technologies such as hydro, solar, wind, and so forth?
Hmm. Uh, yes, this is one of the concerns that I have. That at the moment, what we're facing is a scarcity of research and development resources. And
Mhm.
then, if we dilute these finite and scarce resources, uh, we may be slowing down some promising technologies. Let me also make sure that I transmit the message that to 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 allow an airplane to fly with passengers requires a lot of investments in health and safety. And,
Hmm.
this is why aviation is so safe as it is today. Um, then, when we are looking at hydrogen, we must make sure that the safety is at least the same as what we have today.
Hmm.
And then a lot of the investment is going to be needed to produce the systems. And this can be done, but not cheaply, to make sure that safety is not compromised in any way. It
Hmm.
is the what we call the certification authorities that require proof that the aircraft is safe. And then this is going to require a concurrent research development effort alongside with certification to make sure that these aircraft are as safe as the aircraft of today. It is my guesstimate, with good funding, this would require about 10 years to achieve.
Hmm. And is that 10 years then bringing us a potential to have a 200-person commercial flight? Is that what that will eventually give us?
Yes. Now, if you look at the slides that I sent you,
Yep.
um, let me look. If you look at the first slide you have,
Mhm.
these are three hydrogen aircraft designed at
Mhm.
Cranfield. They are what we call first generation aircraft. And you have there table of distances that
Mhm.
give you a view of the capacity, passenger capacity, and the distance
Mhm.
this aircraft can travel. So you can see on top the gray part, the dark gray part is the hydrogen tank. So you see the
Mhm.
aircraft
Yep.
called HMR, hydrogen medium range, can carry
Mhm.
388 passengers for 3,300 nautical miles. That can
Mhm.
comfortably do London to New York, for example. The one at the bottom could do
Mhm.
230 passengers, and it could do London to Sydney with a single stop. 5,500 nautical miles is a magic number that allows you
Mm.
to go anywhere on the planet with just one stop. So that gives a
Wow.
measure of the
Okay.
capacity that could be possible. Let me also tell you, these are not just pretty pictures. These are the
Yep.
outcomes of a year of calculations.
So how could you figure this out without because at the moment it would take a lot of funding to test this. How were you able to know that this is the requirement or this is able to make that flight without a physical I guess test?
Yes, over time, we have, and it's not just us, there are many
Mm.
organizations that do this. Cranfield has a special activity in aviation, and we have analytical tools that use information from past aircraft and use predictions that we can make. And we have also included what we call uncertainty margins. So then it is
Mhm.
our expectation that the aircraft is more capable than we are showing in the picture. But being conservative, we say, this is what looks like nearly certainly achievable.
Yeah, wow, that's incredible. So when and of course I'll put this up on screen for everyone who's watching on
Yes.
YouTube and whatnot. But we're looking at these big gray, I'm guessing they're batteries and engines and fuel cells.
These are just hydrogen tanks.
Right.
Then, if we go to the second picture,
Yep.
that is the aircraft you can see on the top left, like moving towards
Mhm.
you. And this is what we call the first innovation wave. In the first innovation wave, we try to
Mhm.
use as much technology that already exist as possible to make the aircraft happen quickly. We do feel there is an urgency in starting to decarbonize. So
Hmm.
then we consider decarbonization more important in this first instance than reducing the operating cost a little bit. So this first
Okay.
innovation wave would teach us a lot. It would start decarbonizing, would be transporting passengers safely. Then in the second
Hmm.
innovation wave, we start to redesign the aircraft to make it more efficient, to make it go longer distances, to make it more economical. In the meantime, the price of hydrogen would be falling. And then in the third
Hmm.
innovation wave, because hydrogen needs to be stored as a liquid on the airplane, this is at
Hmm.
minus 250 degrees centigrade.
Wow.
This
Yep.
gives great potential to use superconductivity. So then in the third innovation wave, maybe 30 years from now, we would be looking at superconducting electrical aircraft. So the aircraft that you see on the left are,
Hmm.
if you like, transformations of the two innovation wave one and two are transformations of current aircraft, and the systems are pretty much the same, but they have a big change in the fuel. So the fuel they use is hydrogen rather than a conventional jet fuel, because hydrogen does not
Hmm.
produce carbon dioxide.
Hmm. Yep. Before we move on, Pericles, I'd love to play devil's advocate for a
Yes,
second. This sound on to me. This sounds incredible. The graphics are insane, and the fact that the last one is called Turbo Cryo Electric sounds incredible. Um, but another big, I'm not going to say competitor, but sister in the renewable field is solar, and a lot
yes,
of critics of solar will say that mining certain minerals like cobalt, manganese, lithium, this is quite a big challenge for the solar industry. Does hydrogen, this is quite a big scale, especially with aviation, and a lot of resources are potentially going to be required for research and development as well as
yes.
implementation. Is there certain challenges that we need to look to overcome, that are based on maybe mining certain things, or wasteful byproducts of this operation?
That is a very interesting question. And again, I do not have the answer to all the questions you are going to ask me. However, th- one thing to remember is not only solar we are looking at, it's not only wind, it's not, some people are reconsidering nuclear, it's not only hydro. It is the combination of all these that we need to
Mhm,
examine together. Um, a question to be asked is, for example, how will the increase in demand of some of these raw materials affect the price in the long term? There are still many questions that remain unanswered. But, we do feel that although there are questions, we don't see them as showstoppers.
mhm, mm. You know what I like about this concept and this perspective? I think a lot of people who are in the camp of, I love my Tesla and electric cars are the solution to everything.
Yes.
But there is nothing in on this world that is a solution to everything. Everything needs to work together, in order for us to tackle this issue of climate change and become a sustainable society. So I like how you pointed out that we need different technologies and innovations to work together. So, in the next 10 to 15 years, in this wave one, is that when we can look to take out the gas and the fuel powered airplanes and start to put in more and more hydroelectric and potentially other alternatives into our airplanes?
The alternatives we are looking at the moment are, if we look at current hydrocarbon fuels in aviation, we are
Mhm,
looking to replace about 85% of that energy with hydrogen, and the remaining 15%, these are the shorter range aircraft, with electricity. As time would go by, and then we would see the two technologies merging through superconductivity, and then electrification would extend to longer ranges in what we call hybrid mechanisms. The other point you made is very important, and this takes us to slide 6, if you like,
Hmm.
in the
Yep.
presentation. And hydrogen for aviation cannot be looked at as you very correctly mentioned, as a single sector solution. When we are decarbonizing aviation, we need to look at decarbonizing a lot of human activities. And what you see here is, in that picture, an exercise that we did at Cranfield, where we looked at decarbonizing the United Kingdom as a country. It was a big and
Hmm.
diverse enough economy. We felt for it to give meaningful results. I would like to stress these are approximate results, but they are meaningful results. So we looked at, just for example, how much more electricity we would need. Uh, if you look at the UK and say today we generate 1 unit of electricity using the current installed capacity is 100 gigawatts of electricity, we would need to quadruple or quintuple the electricity produced to be able to green the country, because it's not only aviation that is going to consume electricity. Electricity is a lot of it is going to be needed to produce the hydrogen. We need to electrify the road transport. It's very likely that a lot of the road transport will move to rail. In particular, some of the heavy goods that are transported around may need to be moved to rail, because that's an efficient way of decarbonizing. Then we looked at carbon capture and storage as an option. We looked at scenarios where we had nuclear energy. We looked at scenarios where we had renewables. And
Hmm.
the expectation, again, is this is not Cranfield, but the British government has done a calculation that over 30 years, this is going to cost 1.3 trillion pounds. This sounds like a lot of money, but it's about 2% of the country's gross domestic product over
Hmm.
these 30 years. And at the moment, we're spending something like 3-4 times this on the health of the population. And we see the environment being a health issue in the longer term. So we feel this
Hmm.
cost is justified. Just for example, the British government is about half the British economy. By the time you look at all the expenditures they make, the biggest one is health.
Hmm. Yeah. Oh, look, we can't say that the environment doesn't impact our health, especially in
Precisely.
Southeast Asia. Places like India have really poor air pollution. LA, I'm not even going to get started on their issues.
Yes, yes,
And
yes.
the UK is definitely not immune to that. I want to
Exactly.
ask you a very big picture question to out of curiosity. So let's say we're 20 or even 30 years down the track in the future. This is
Hmm.
2050 at the moment. Most countries at this stage have promised to be net zero at this stage in our lives. What percentage of the power on a global average do you think hydrogen has the opportunity to offer?
Uh, Again, looking at the numbers here, if we go back to the table that I just had on the screen,
Hmm.
um, hydrogen would need about, say, a third to 40% of the electricity supply, a greatly increased electricity supply over what we use today. And aviation
Hmm.
would consume about half of this hydrogen.
Hmm.
These are the numbers for the UK, but they may not be exactly the same globally, but they are not going to be
Hmm.
that far out globally. So this shows the study for the UK.
Yeah, that's really, really cool. And
Mhm.
is hydrogen and renewable energy to blame for the fuel prices you have in the UK right now?
It's
I
interesting you say that. Energy prices are now expensive globally, and
Mhm.
one of the reasons is in trying to move away from fossil fuel, there was perhaps not enough investment in fossil fuels. And when we have a shortage of fossil fuels, because of the situation in Ukraine, in part, then what you find there is a lack of supply, and we are now in the strange position that at least the UK is subsidizing fossil fuels to alleviate the economic impact. Going back to this idea that sustainability has a very important economic dimension. So
Mhm.
we're
With that,
seeing that as being lived in as we speak.
I really find that a fascinating topic, the decarbonisation and what impact it has on our economy. When we're
Yes,
looking at this Ukraine price crisis that you just mentioned, I know here the fuel prices in Australia are not fun. In the UK, I've heard it's much worse,
yes.
and lots of people around the world are struggling. So, when we're kind of looking to adapt to more renewable energies, hydrogen, solar, all of that, should we look at economically to supply most of our own energy, or should we still have this reliance on other nations to import energy from their nation?
Now, again, I don't want to be speaking out of turn here,
Mhm.
but if you look at a country, and let me use an example of Germany. Germany has now promised, along with many European countries, to start foregoing the import of Russian oil.
Mhm.
They are also keen on removing nuclear power. Politically, they have taken the decision to gradually discontinue the use of nuclear power. A
Mhm.
lot of energy in Germany is also coming from imported Russian gas, and you may have noticed there was no mention of Russian gas in this embargo.
Mhm.
So then, if you look at a country like Germany, for example, that has taken the political decision to reduce nuclear, is gradually taking the political decision to stop hydrocarbon imports, then, and it also has a huge energy consumption, uh, can it be dependent only on German renewables? We don't feel that is tenable. And the same applies to many countries in the world. So the question is, if you look at the countries around the equator, these are the ones that have the most ample source of solar energy. And there's a lot of it around. But you find these are also, again, there is a band of low income countries around the equator. So the social impact of selling solar electricity would be huge, would be very, very favorable. But it would mean we would need to rely on international trade for the global energy supply. And that is an interesting political question for which I don't have the answer.
It's definitely something that's very fascinating for all of us to think about, especially those educated on the topic, potentially more than the both of us, and decarbonizing everything. But
Yes,
economically speaking, something you mentioned earlier, something to be sustainable, both as a technology and as part of our lives, it has to be
yeah,
economically viable. So I want to talk about something potentially more economical than planes, which is actually cars. So is
yes.
this same technology, hydropower, is that possible to be extracted in the same way and implemented that you have in planes into vehicles like cars and trucks and motorbikes that we use daily?
Let me offer a direct answer to the question, but also an issue that may materialize.
Please.
Um, Now, as far as cars go, um, it would be more efficient, it would require less electricity produced to have electrical cars rather than hydrogen cars. Um, Now, using hydrogen can give you quite a light power plant, but its efficiency, its energy efficiency is going to be lower. Using cars, using the electricity directly will give you a more efficient but much heavier system. In an airplane, this weight consideration is a serious issue. This is why we see so much hydrogen used in planes. In a car,
Mm-hmm.
the weight issues, of course, is some of a problem, but is a much lesser problem than it is in aviation. So we would expect only a relatively small proportion of cars or trucks to be powered by hydrogen, those that need to travel long distances. While cars that travel in the city, we would expect them to be electrical. As far as lorries go, uh, quite a bit of the road transport could go to rail transport. There might be an expansion of the railways as part of electrification.
Mm-hmm.
So, if we look at aviation, we need to produce electricity, to produce hydrogen, to produce propulsive power. In the case of the car, the electricity we produce could be charged directly into car batteries to produce a propulsive power much more efficiently, but with a heavier system. So, in a nutshell, that's the
Mm.
path. Now, when we say we should do tourism, more locally, again, looking at it from a global perspective, there are some island economies that rely a lot on aviation to take their tourists. And tourism may be 50,
Mhm.
60% of the economy of that island. So then removing the tourist trade from such an island, you really sentence that island to economic oblivion.
Mm.
So again, it may be strange to think in this way. I do feel the richer countries have some kind of responsibility to the poorer countries in the world, and tourism, is one of the if like of the mechanisms to transfer wealth from the richer countries to the poorer countries. Here in Europe, just for example, the tourist industry is worth about €1 trillion. This is pre-COVID, of course. It was
Mhm.
nearly €1 trillion every year, and it was close to 1 million jobs. So then,
Mhm.
removing aviation or reducing aviation would have a big impact on this tourist industry.
Mm. Definitely. I mean, here's an opportunity or a bit of an issue I have just based on what we just talked about. So,
Hmm.
when we just look at, let's say, South Australia. So, South Australia actually powers a lot, or actually a decent amount of their electricity is generated from the rooftops of
Okay.
residential homes.
Yes.
And they have a lot of solar plants here, and some towns in this state are about 85% purely solar energy. That's it.
Yes.
Now, and then on top of that, you have people driving electric cars. So, in the mind of a consumer and an everyday person, okay, I can see that there's solar here. I can see
Hmm.
that people drive electric cars, and they almost associate them to be synonymous with each other. And so the people who did the personal relations and the public relations of solar and electric cars did an amazing job. So people
Yes.
understand. And so I think that has been a big help to their economic growth because people are now
Hmm.
thinking that is a safe alternative. With hydrogen, the way that I'm thinking of it based on this conversation is it's got a lot of opportunity to power cities, but in the back, and it also got a lot of opportunity to power things like ships, like you mentioned, and we might get into, and
Mhm.
aviation. And it might not be at the front of a consumer's mind. Now, given how successful I think solar and electric cars are, do
Mhm.
you think it's a problem that the average human is going to be maybe disconnected to the potentials of hydrogen power?
Well, I can only respond with a hope here. It is my hope it isn't, because you can say hydrogen is a form of renewable power, and it can, like renewable power is decarbonizing some things, renewable power through hydrogen is decarbonizing aviation. Um, Let me also say that electrification and hydrogen go hand in hand. You cannot have one without having the other. So they go hand in hand. And then, for example, in the United Kingdom, um, a lot of fossil fuels are consumed for heating up places. So a lot
Mhm.
of gas is consumed for heating up, and some liquid fuels are used for heating gas, for heating homes. Then for heating, we see the provision of electricity. If we forgo fossil fuels, then this heating will be provided by electricity. So cars would be using partly electricity, partly hydrogen, more electricity than hydrogen. Ships will probably using more hydrogen than electricity. Electricity only for some smaller coastal ships. Airplanes would be using primarily hydrogen. So you can see there is a spectrum of consumers for hydrogen and electricity, and we
Mhm.
need to choose which one is the right for each set of circumstances.
Mhm. See, I didn't even know that it was possible for a car to be powered by both solar or electricity and
Yes.
hydrogen simultaneously.
Now, I'm not saying simultaneously. I'm indicating that you have choices. And if, for
Mhm.
example, your interest is in a car to drive around the city, for to go from place A to B, with relatively
Mhm.
low use, so then electricity is probably the right choice. If you're in a city, you don't
Mhm.
want to go very far, then you can have an electric car. If, on the other hand, you're driving a taxi, then charging times, at least at the moment, are quite long, and then you may be better off with hydrogen.
Mm.
So I don't think we would see both technologies in one car, but you choose one car or
Mhm.
another.
That's very fascinating how we can
Yes,
target different sectors and
exactly.
industries depending on their needs. That's very, very
Yes,
cool.
yes, yes, yes.
Um, so I guess piggybacking on this, when it comes to hydrogen technologies at the moment, I see it as mainly up to governments and corporations and businesses to really make strides in this technology. So, what is the role of a consumer to help this technology grow?
Well, uh, it's very interesting because a very similar experience has already happened. You mentioned solar, and it was used in many homes in South Australia. I would imagine there would have been government support to put these solar
Hmm.
systems in place. The same
Yep.
happened in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom now produces, I use the United Kingdom as an example because it's an economy I know a little bit better. But
Please,
in the
yeah.
United, yes, in the United Kingdom, what we have had is for 30 years, there have been direct government subsidies to renewable energies, solar, wind, offshore wind as well. Um, so that they put in place. There was also a legal subsidy, which was renewable energy, what had what we call priority access to the electricity grid. In other words, if electrical energy was produced from renewables, the generating if like the electricity management system had to take that energy with a priority. And also there was a private subsidy that the electricity bills, have been a little bit more expensive. So, and this must have been for something like 30 years. So we had a combination of a private subsidy, legal support, and consumers making contribution because it was for the greater good. I have never found a number. I look very hard to find, how much this cost the taxpayer. But I do believe that this has been a cost that was necessary and well worth it. I would have paid it
Mhm.
again, and I know many people would have paid it again. We need something similar for the transition into hydrogen, which is really the next step of the same process. So then,
Mhm.
you would have government support to do our research and development and install the aircraft. You would have um, legal support that this aircraft will have some kind of priority on the landing rights of airports, and you could also then expect the consumer to pay a little bit more.
Mhm.
In this, of course, the consumer is a traveler.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
all we're
So
advocating is a carbon copy of the past.
yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Now that is something that the media love to talk about. And in particular, there's certain groups of media who are sponsored by the fossil fuel industry that really give hydro and other renewables a bad rap, saying that you're expected to pay. No one's going to be able to travel because it's just going to become so expensive if we adopt these technologies. So what are your thoughts on how much extra realistically this is going to cost the traveler to fly from point A to B?
Well, what was interesting, again, going back to the electricity costs, if we look at the yearly bill, the yearly, or, you know, I pay the electricity for my house every
Mm,
2 months. Over the years, I have not noticed much difference, and it goes up and down. There has been a big difference
mhm,
now with the fossil fuel crunch we have had. That's the biggest
mhm,
ever. But what happens very often is the management of the transition. How do you manage the transition so you have a gradual introduction of this additional cost so you don't put in a step change so as to protect from a sudden contraction in demand? Uh, and this is, I feel this could be done, it has been done already. You mentioned companies that produce fossil fuels and power producers. I believe they are part of the solution. So I guess we need
mm,
people like you to go and talk to them and tell them, look, fossil fuel company, you have the global infrastructure, you have the experience of big projects, you have the experience with very large energy investments, you have the experience with health and safety. They have taken a lot of measures to protect the environment. So why don't you could go and explain to them that they could be a key player in this new technology. And
mm.
some of these fossil fuel companies, they have PR that is already indicating that this is something they are doing. So I feel there is potential for them as well, to gain from this transition if they look at it in an open mind. If they were to listen to you.
That's really, really fascinating.
Mm.
I almost never could imagine a world where Shell or Chevron or any BP, any of these companies would actually go from extruding fossil fuels to then making hydrogen energy. That sounds so utopic and unrealistic. But I suppose on all they want to do is make money.
Make a
That's
profit.
pretty
Yes,
much
yes,
it.
yes.
That's right. So I guess when you look at it, we just need to make it more economical, these kind of energies. Why wouldn't they switch? So that's a really, really powerful point, and I think it's a very, very well worth thinking about.
Yet you mentioned Shell. Why couldn't they sell hydrogen? They would need to get closer together to some of the big power companies as well. But
Mm,
they have actually everything to make a good business proposition out of it, and a lot of capital to
mm.
it, especially now that oil is so expensive.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so we touched on airplanes, we touched on cars. Something you do work a lot with as well are ships. Not
Yes.
just cruise ships, which I'm sure could make for an interesting conversation, but tanker
Mm.
ships in particular. So tanker ships I find fascinating because in my research on environmental degradation through multiple means, when I'm thinking the extraction of crude oils from the ground,
Mhm.
sometimes, and you might have seen in the news, this can unfortunately result in explosions, massive pollutants, the death of humans and non human life alike. So there's a lot of danger here when we're transporting hydrogen or powering these ships with hydrogen. Are there certain ecological disasters that we have to think about?
Well, uh, let me go back to accidents and to everyday safety. They're two very separate things. Accidents are very, very, very rare. Whether you look at ships, they do have an impact, and you have oil spills. Then the question is, in a safety system for a hydrogen tanker, we have actually designed a hydrogen tanker ship, and if you are interested, we can send you some details. But the idea is there's
I
going to
read the
be
paper actually. It was very fascinating.
oh, have you? Okay.
Yeah.
Um, so we do see sea trade of hydrogen by pipeline, and we do see ship trade as well. Like we have it today for oil and for
Mhm,
gas. Then
mhm,
it becomes a question, and this is where the big investment needs to take place to make sure that when something happens, you don't have a disaster. Again, in
mhm,
the case, so there are two types of disaster to protect from. One disaster is the local situation and loss of life on a ship or on an airplane. This is why the
mhm,
emphasis on safety. You have fail-safe systems, you have redundant systems, um, and also the ecological disaster. In terms of ecological disaster, uh, if there is a hydrogen spill, uh, as long as the hydrogen doesn't catch fire, there are currently well established ways of venting gaseous hydrogen to the atmosphere, and then the same health and safety techniques could be applied on the ships. So it is not a trivial matter, but it is not a showstopper. These things can be
mhm,
done, and it is part of the investment that we feel needs to take place. I'm not in a position to answer all the questions because many of these questions will be answered through, if you like, research and development that needs to take place.
mhm.
But given the current safety that exists with hydrogen systems, we feel it's not the biggest of problems that needs to be overcome. The biggest problem we see is where do we get the short-term funding for the transition?
Of course.
Yes.
What I think about quite a bit during this conversation is like how young the field and industry really is. So when I'm thinking of we're going to need a transition where we're at one stage, we're not going to have enough workers or researchers to develop these technologies. Like we need so many great minds working on that. So I feel like, and I'm sure you might agree with me here, that if someone is looking to get into a field in sustainability and how and a greener future, this is
Mhm.
really something that will be prosperous for many, many decades.
It's interesting you say that. Sometimes when I work at a university called Cranfield University, and very often, when I finish a presentation, what I say is, and to succeed in this noble enterprise, you're going to need many thousands of Cranfield graduates. This is to make all this happen.
Mm,
This is another challenge we need to make, is the young people that are going to make it happen in the long term need to be
mhm,
prepared, need to be talented, need to be encouraged to go into this industry. There's
mhm.
huge, this is why I mentioned it's so exciting. There's so much opportunity, and there's so many international problems that can be solved this way that, you know, it makes me very optimistic.
Lovely. I'm going to round this out with one last question for
Okay.
you, Pericles. Is there anything that we didn't cover in regards to hydropower that you'd love to leave the listeners with? Or on another note, you could just leave us with a piece of your wisdom, a nugget regarding something we talked about today or something completely unrelated that you just love to leave us with.
First of all, let me say you're very kind to call it wisdom. It's not wisdom, it's just results of some calculations. um, but if there was a message to give, is to younger people that might be interested in in uh, in this noble endeavor, that there is plenty of opportunity to them to enjoy both as creators of, if you like, of these new technologies, but also as users of this new technology. So just join me in being excited and optimistic.
I love it. What a beautiful way to close off this discussion. Thank you so much, Professor Pilidis, for joining us for this
It's good to talk to you,
conversation.
Tom.
It's been amazing. I want to thank you, just to round this out, for the work you do. It is, climate change is a looming threat. Sustainability
Mhm.
is something we need yesterday and last
Yes.
year, and something we'll need for many years to come. So I really appreciate the work you do. Although I can tell you're very passionate and you love it, and you've contributed a lot of, I think there was like over 100 papers that you had contributed to. So
Mhm.
I find it very, very inspiring that you can contribute to something so, like you say, noble. I really do appreciate it as a fellow human, that will share this earth and for many generations to come, so they can use this hydrogen technology to live a safe life. So thank you for the work that you do and the research that you contribute to our global society.
Mhm. Well, it's great to talk to you. So thank you for the opportunity to address your audience.
Hi there. Welcome to the end of the episode. Thank you for listening the whole way through. And thank you again to Professor Pilidis for coming on and leaving us with a whole lot to think about, and with a few golden nuggets as well. For those wanting to get in contact with him, I'm sure a lot of you might have a question or two. As much as I know about hydrogen, I'm still very much a beginner in the field. I will leave Pericles' email address in the show notes below. If you just email him and just in the subject line say the plant paradigm, he'll know what we kind of spoke about on this episode. So if you have questions regarding the slides or regarding what we talked about, he'll definitely be able to address that a lot better than I can. And he's definitely a helpful hand and a well of knowledge. So I highly recommend emailing him if you have any further questions. And if you want to connect with us more, feel free to join our mailing list, which you can join at theplantparadigm.com. And of course, we have our Instagram, which is the majority of where I live when it comes to the plant paradigm, just to post a lot of reels and carousels in regards to solutions to climate change and how our diet can play into this, how the way we transport around town can play into this, and etc. etc. With that being said, I hope everyone has